Paula Roy here, bringing you another segment in our Taste of Wellington West virtual programming. On behalf of the Wellington West BIA, I'm really excited to share with you some of my favorite kitchen hacks. These are tips and tricks that I use on a regular basis to make my time in the kitchen just that much easier. They're great for efficiency and also just to have a better result sometimes with your cooking. A lot of them I've picked up from various chefs that work in the Wellington West area, and some of them have just been learned by trial and error in the many, many years that I have spent in my own kitchen. So bear with me, the very best tip comes at the end, so I hope you'll watch right through to find out what it is. First up, we're going to stick with one of my seasonal favorites, and that's dealing with cherry tomatoes. I've had a bumper crop in my garden this year, and I'm using them a lot in dishes, and I often like to cut them in half, but it's a real nuisance if you're doing a couple of cups worth to have to cut each one. So the trick here is to get two identical lids. In this case, I've got two matching yogurt lids. Line up the tomatoes on the bottom lid, put the top one on, and with a big knife, just slice right through the middle. And that's it. So simple, and I've got all my cherry tomatoes cut and ready to go. Now, ginger is another ingredient that I love to use a lot, except it can be a real nuisance to peel with all the little lumps and knobs and so on. So what I've discovered is that rather than a sharp knife or even a peeler, a spoon is a much better option. You can just hold the ginger, and just scrape at it, and the papery skin comes right off. And if you happen to own a grapefruit spoon, it's even better with its little serrated tip. So look how easy that is. A couple times a year I'll buy a big quantity of ginger, and I love to peel it like this and grate it up with the fine side of my box grater, tuck it in a Ziploc bag in the freezer, and then it's just as good as fresh anytime you need a little bit to add to a recipe. Now, tomato paste, I don't know about you, but I use a lot of tomato paste. My family loves Italian food, and it's a great way to add a depth of flavor and even color to a dish, and it works as a thickener as well. But when I buy cans of tomato paste, sometimes I find I just need a tablespoon or two, and then I have to deal with the rest of the can. For years I would scoop it out kind of a tablespoon at a time onto parchment paper, freeze it, and then take those frozen dollops and put them in a bag in the freezer. But instead, now I buy tubes of concentrated tomato paste. You can get them at the grocery store, and they're likely available at specialty food stores like Parma Ravioli and Nicastro's as well. And you use less of it because it's concentrated. You just take the cap off, squeeze out the amount you need into your dish, put the cap on, into the fridge it goes, and it stores for months and months and months. So it's super, super convenient. Eggs Benedict. Love Eggs Benedict. My family loves Eggs Benedict, and we make it a lot. But over the years, as we've grown in size, especially with significant others coming for meals, it can be a challenge to try and juggle pots of boiling water with a bunch of egg poachers. So this trick is perfect. You can make great poached eggs in an ordinary muffin pan. You just add a tablespoon of water to each compartment. Then you crack your eggs into each compartment. Put it in a 350-degree Fahrenheit oven for about 10 to 13 minutes, depending on how runny you want your yolk. And then they pop right out and they're ready to serve. I'm a big fan of batch cooking. I love to make larger quantities of things like lasagnas and stuffed pastas and even meat pies and so on, shepherd's pie. But it can be challenging to use up all of my best cook and serve dishes in the freezer. So I've taken to using these foil pans with cardboard lids. You can get them at dollar stores, at the grocery store, and so on. And what's particularly useful about these is that these tins contain such a small amount of metal, you can actually put them in the microwave. So I fill them, I write on the cardboard what it is and what the reheating instructions are in case I'm going to gift them to someone who is in need of a meal. And I just take them out of the freezer, take the lid off, put the dish right in the microwave, and I can thaw it. If it's not cooked, then it's ready to go in the oven to finish baking, or if it is fully cooked, I can just continue to reheat it until it's hot right here in these pans. So they're really, really, really handy. I was kind of amazed when a chef taught me this trick. I remember asking about vegetables and how to cook them the best and what size to cut them, and I got lots of different bits of information, but the piece of information that really stuck with me was this simple rule of thumb. For anything that grows in the ground, so carrots, turnips, potatoes, you always start them in cold water in the pot. because they're denser, it'll give them time to heat up in a more uniform way. For anything that grows above ground, so thinking beans, peas, so on, you want to start them in boiling water because they're going to cook very quickly, and by the time the center cooks, the outside will be overcooked if you start them in cold water. So that's kind of a neat, handy tip. Fresh herbs add so much flavor to dishes, and I really love cooking with them. I grow a lot in my garden, and during the winter I have an indoor garden, a hydroponic garden that I use. But lots of people ask me all the time, I just bought a big bunch of whatever, cilantro, dill, I've used a little bit to make this special dish, now what do I do with the rest, because I don't want it to spoil, I don't want to have to throw it out. And I can't believe how often I get asked this. So this is a two-part tip. The first part is that you want to chop it up fairly uniformly and small size because it'll freeze and thaw better. I love to use my pizza cutter for this because you can just get little bits by going back and forth, and all of a sudden I've got all this great chopped dill, and it just took seconds to do that. I think I'll do just a little bit more here. Then the second part of this tip is that I take little Ziploc bags, and this one is labeled Dill 2020, so I remember when I did it, and you just pop the herbs in the bag, and then you can use water if you wish. I like to add olive oil just because it infuses the oil with a lot of flavor, and the two together become a great component for a dish. So in this case, I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons of olive oil, and then I'm going to seal up my bag, kind of pressing the air out as I go. And I'm going to put it flat in the freezer. This will firm up nicely. The olive oil will become opaque, but anytime now I want to add a bit of dill to a soup, for example, or a sauce, I can just go in the freezer, open this bag, crack off a corner, put it in my dish, and put the rest of the bag back in the freezer. So I have bags of pretty much every herb imaginable in there, and it's really handy, particularly in the winter. So speaking of herbs, they do add so much flavor, as we mentioned, and there's unique ways you can use them that you might not have thought of. And this is a favorite also from a chef, and that's to make a basting brush with fresh herbs. So I've just got an ordinary wooden spoon here. You could use a silicone spoon if that's what you have in your kitchen. And I've tied 4 sprigs of rosemary using some ordinary kitchen twine. It's cotton, and so it's not going to add any chemically flavor should it happen to get in contact with the food. You just dunk this in your marinade and brush it on the meat as it's cooking. Or if you want to be brushing pan juices for something that's roasted in the oven, same thing. So super, super handy. Holy guacamole. Do we ever eat a lot of guacamole? And sometimes my family will use the whole container. That's great. I like to make homemade, but sometimes I do buy it. Everybody's got to just do what they can, right? So the leftover guacamole, there's nothing sadder in my mind than brown guacamole. It just means it hasn't been cared for. So my favorite tip for storing it is to smooth out the top of whatever you've got left over in a container that has a tight lid, and then you pour, believe it or not, milk over the top. And that just makes a great barrier to keep the air from turning the guacamole brown. Put it back in the fridge, and then when you're ready to enjoy it the next day or the day after, you just simply drain off the milk. There, it's almost all gone. Give it a little stir, and your guacamole is as good as new. Ice cream, we love ice cream. Boy, do we eat a lot of ice cream. Gelato also, and we're fortunate to have great sources here along Wellington West. But I don't like it when they get ice crystally on top. When you go in, open the container, and you've got to kind of either pick those off or suck them up and put them in your bowl. So what I learned is that you can keep your gelato or ice cream really fresh, same with frozen yogurt. If you take a piece of plastic wrap, lay it over the top after you've served your serving, press it down so it's really adhered to the surface of the product in the container, put the lid back on, into the freezer. The next time you go to serve it up, it's going to be super fresh and great and no ice crystals. And if you happen to transport gelato or ice cream, if you're still going to the cottage or taking some, if you're visiting family, bubble wrap is the perfect insulator for these containers. They can stay out of the freezer for a couple of hours and they'll still be nicely frozen if you wrap them in bubble wrap. A lot of people find that tomatoes can be kind of acidic. I hear older people sometimes complaining about them being too acidic, and the temptation is to add sugar to combat that acidity, but I don't like to add sugar to a savory dish if it's not called for. So my secret weapon to combat acidity in tomatoes is to put a peeled carrot into a pot of a tomato-based sauce. So say it's a pasta sauce or whatever. Let it simmer for half an hour to an hour, and the natural sugars in the carrot will infuse into the dish and combat the acidity. If you don't have time for that, or you don't have any carrots, another great idea is to add just a pinch or two of baking soda, and it works to neutralize the acid super quickly. It'll even kind of foam up, which will show you that it's reacting with the acid. Don't add too much, or you might notice a bit of a salty flavor. I keep baking soda in a little shaker right on my kitchen counter to do that, as well as for scrubbing stuck on things in pots and pans. Squash. Fall is perfect for squash season, and I love to cook squash. I love to eat squash, but for years I wrestled with how to cut them open and also how to get the seeds out. So the trick for cutting them open is to poke them all over with a fork and microwave for a couple of minutes on medium power, just until they start to yield when you go to cut them in half with the knife. And then to get the seeds out, ice cream scoop. Best idea ever. I have bent more spoons in my drawer trying to scoop seeds out, but the ice cream scoop has a really sharp edge on the top, and it's also really sturdy, and it scoops through the flesh to get the seeds out so easily. And our second last tip today is making wedge fries. My family loves wedge fries. I love wedge fries too. Nice and herby, maybe with some Parmesan on them, with olive oil of course. But I always used to struggle with trying to cut them to get the pieces uniform size so that they would cook evenly. And I'd kind of eyeball it, and I'd be doing angles with my big knife, and it never worked out quite the way I wanted. So my trick now is to use an apple slicer. So you take your potato and just cut a slice off the bottom so it'll sit nice and flat on the cutting board. And then you center the apple cutter and press down, and I'm just kind of wiggling it as I go. And I'm going to pull these out. Perfect uniform wedges for wedge fries. So happy to have learned that. All right, I promised a good one for the last one. I wish I'd learned this like 30 years ago. Parchment paper, love it, use a lot of it. Sometimes silicone mats are great for cookies and so on, but if you're trying to line a bread pan or a cake pan, for example, it's really hard to get the parchment to sit down and stay inside the pan. You can try origamying the corners and all that, but it's really, really hard. So my new trick is to take my piece of parchment paper and cut generously enough to overhang on all four sides of my pan. This will be a little loud, but I'm gonna crumple it up. Okay, nice and crumpled. And now I would normally do it under running water, but the sink's back there. So I'm just dunking it in this bowl of tap water. Nothing fancy, it's kind of room temperature. It doesn't have to be hot or cold. And I'm smushing it around to make sure that the paper's nice and wet. And now I'm just letting it drain. If I were over the sink, I would just give it a generous shake, kind of like I'm just about to do behind me now. There we go, nice big shake. Now it's all soft and pliable, so when I go to put it in my pan, it's just gonna snuggle down in there and sit beautifully, ready for me to add my batter, my dough, whatever it is I want to put in the pan. Isn't that great? Such a simple trick. So I hope you have found these kitchen hacks to be interesting or informative, and that you'll try one or two of them in your own kitchen. And if you do, please consider taking a photo of the kitchen hack that you've used and post it on social media with the hashtag Taste of Wellington West. You'll automatically be entered into our draw to win a $50 gift card from the merchant of your choosing. Thanks for watching.